Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales, the place where legends are born and ghosts walk in the daylight. Tonight's story is about a man who tried to outrun the devil, only to find that some devils wear a politician's smile and a sheriff's badge. It's a tale of a love that promised salvation, and a hatred that delivered a terrible, righteous reckoning. So listen closely to the wind, folks, for it still whispers the name of the man they call Black Jack, and the story we call The Last Sunset for Dustwater. The past was a country from which Cole McRae was a permanent exile. He had tried to burn the bridges, salt the earth, and forget the language, but the accent still clung to him in the silence of the night. It was there in the network of silvery scars that mapped his back and ribs, souvenirs from blades and bullets that had failed to do their job. It was there in the phantom weight on his hip, a space where a cold peacemaker had rested for so long it felt more a part of him than his own skin. And it was there in his eyes, the pale, washed-out blue of a winter sky, which held a stillness that was often mistaken for peace, but was in fact the dead calm at the center of a hurricane that had never truly passed. Here, in the parched back end of creation known as Dustwater, he was not an exile. He was just a ghost. No one knew the name Black Jack, the moniker he had earned in a blur of gunpowder and blood from the Cimarron Strip to the Rio Grande. No one knew the man who could draw a pistol and end a life in the space between two heartbeats. In Dustwater, he was simply Cole, the quiet man who had bought the old Miller homestead 2 years back. He was the man who worked a stubborn plot of land from sunup to sundown, his powerful shoulders and scarred hands dedicated to the task of coaxing life from the unforgiving soil. He owned a rifle for coyotes and a shotgun for snakes, but he never wore a pistol. To wear a pistol was to invite the past to dinner, and Cole knew that ghost was a guest who would never leave. Dustwater itself was a town clinging to existence by a thread. It was a single, wide street of sun-bleached, false-fronted buildings, a place where the primary colors were brown, beige, and the faded blue of a worn-out pair of denims. The wind was the town's most constant resident, a ceaseless, mournful presence that blew dust into everything's water, the whiskey, and the weary dreams of its inhabitants. It was a place people ended up, not a place they chose. It was the perfect place for a ghost to hide. His life was a routine of punishing, monastic simplicity. He would rise before the sun, in his old wounds a familiar morning prayer. He'd work the fields, tend his single horse and to milk cows, and repair the endless decay that the sun and wind inflicted upon his small world. The physical exhaustion was a blessing. It kept the memories at bay, pushing them down below the surface until nightfall, when they would inevitably return in his dreams, the faces of men he had killed, the roar of guns, the smell of blood and fear. He would wake in a cold sweat, his hands clenched into fists, the ghost of Black Jack clawing at the door of the quiet man named Cole. It was on a trip into town for supplies that he first truly saw her, and it was like seeing the sun for the first time after a lifetime in a cave. Her name was Clara Thorne, the town schoolteacher. She was not a classic beauty in the way of the saloon girls he had known in his former life. Her beauty was of a quieter, more profound sort. It was in the kindness of her hazel eyes, the determined set of her jaw, and the way she moved with a quiet grace that seemed to defy the ugliness of the town around her. She was an oasis of gentle strength in a desert of weary resignation. He would watch her from a distance, a silent, unseen guardian. He saw the way she treated the town's children, a brood of dusty, barefoot kids that most people ignored, with a fierce, protective tenderness. She taught them not just their letters and numbers, but their worth. She was fighting a war against the ignorance and despair that Dustwater bred into its children, and her weapons were chalk, dog-eared books, and a belief in a better world that Cole had long since abandoned. Their first real conversation happened on a blistering afternoon when the shutter on the schoolhouse window broke, banging against the clapboard in the relentless wind. Cole, who had been passing by on his buckboard, stopped without a second thought. He took his tools and, in a matter of minutes, had the shutter secured, the loud, disruptive noise replaced by a welcome quiet. Clara came outside, wiping her dusty hands on her apron, a small, genuine smile on her face. "Thank you, Mr. McRae." That noise was about to drive us all to distraction. "It's just Cole," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. "And it was no trouble." "Well, Just Cole, you have my gratitude, and that of 20 very noisy students. She looked at his hands, at the scarred, calloused knuckles and the sure, competent way he handled the tools. You're good at fixing things. I've had some practice breaking them, he replied, the words slipping out before he could stop them, a small, bleak truth from his other life. She didn't flinch or recoil. Instead, her kind eyes held his, and she saw the flicker of pain behind the remark. Then I'd say that makes you the perfect man for the job, she said softly. It's the ones who know how things break who are best at putting them back together. That was the beginning. Their conversations became a regular occurrence. He would find reasons to be in town, to mend a fence near the schoolhouse, to offer her a ride back to the small house she rented at the edge of town. Their courtship, if it could be called that, was a slow, tentative thing, a delicate dessert flower blooming in the most unlikely of places. She never asked about his past, about the scars he carried on his body and in his soul. She seemed to understand that his silence on the matter was a wall around a place too painful to touch. Instead, she spoke of the future, of the books she wanted to order for the children, of her dream of starting a small-town library. For Cole, being with Clara was like drinking cool, clean water after a lifetime of whiskey and bile. She saw not the ghost of Black Jack, but the man named Cole. She saw a quiet, gentle man with sad eyes, and she believed, with the full force of her pure heart, that he was a good man. Her belief was a seed. For the first time in a decade, Cole began to believe it himself. He began to imagine a future that wasn't just an endless series of empty days, but a life. A life with her. The thought was as terrifying as it was beautiful. To love her was to have something to lose, and Black Jack had learned long ago that the only way to survive was to have nothing. But the fragile peace they were building was not destined to last. Dustwater, for all its sleepiness, was not immune to the greed that was the true engine of the West. A new mayor had arrived a few months prior, a man named Alistair Sterling. He was a slick, well-dressed man from the East, with a politician's smile that never reached his cold, calculating eyes. He spoke of progress and prosperity, of bringing the railroad through, of turning Dustwater from a forgotten backwater into a boomtown. His partner in this grand vision was a local land baron named Jedediah Thorne, a ruthless, brutish man who owned the vast cattle ranch that surrounded the town and held the mortgage on half the businesses in it. Thorne was the hammer, and Sterling was the velvet glove that concealed it. Together, they began to squeeze Dustwater. They raised taxes, bought up water rights, and used a newly hired force of thuggish deputies to enforce their will. The townspeople, weary and disorganized, grumbled but submitted. They were used to being ground under the heel of one master or another. Clara, however, would not submit. She saw Sterling's progress for what it was, a land grab that would push out the small homesteaders and turn the free people of the town into little more than serfs. When Sterling demanded the schoolhouse be used for a town meeting to vote on signing over mineral rights to his new development company, Clara refused. She argued that the school was a place of learning, not a venue for a corrupt political charade. When she began to teach the older children about civil rights and the Constitution, using books she had ordered with her own meager salary, Sterling saw her not just as an obstacle, but as a threat. An educated populace was the last thing a tyrant wanted. The confrontation came one afternoon, right on the steps of the schoolhouse. Sterling and Thorne, flanked by two of their deputies, arrived to find Clara barring the door. Cole was in town that day and saw the confrontation from across the street. A cold, familiar dread washed over him. "Miss Thorne," Sterling said, his voice using a false politeness. "We have a town ordinance that requires a vote on this matter. You are obstructing the law. The only law you're interested in, Mayor, is the law of your own pocketbook," Clara replied, her voice steady, though Cole could see the slight tremor in her hands. "You will not use this school to legitimize your theft of this town's future." Thorne stepped forward, his face a mask of brutish anger. "You're a long way from home, schoolmarm. You do well to remember that. This is our town. We decide what's best for it." "This is our town," Clara corrected him, her gaze sweeping past him to include the handful of townsfolk who had gathered to watch. "And what is best for it is that our children learn to read and think for themselves, so they don't grow up to be bullied by men like you." The quiet dignity and unshakable courage of her words hung in the dusty air. Thorne took a menacing step toward her, but Sterling put a restraining hand on his arm. The mayor's cold eyes shifted and found Cole, who was now standing by his wagon, his arms crossed, his winter sky eyes fixed on them. Sterling didn't know who Cole was, but he recognized the stillness of a dangerous man. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head to Thorne. "Not now. Not here." Sterling forced his smile back into place. "We will settle this another time, Miss Thorne. But be assured, we will settle it." They turned and walked away, leaving Clara standing alone on the schoolhouse steps, a solitary figure of defiance. Cole walked across the street to her. Her brave facade crumbled as he approached, and he saw the fear she had been hiding. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "I'm all right," she said, though she wasn't. I won't let them do this. This town may not have much, but it has a soul. They won't take that." He looked at her, at this small, fierce woman who was willing to stand up to monsters for the sake of an ideal. He, who had spent his life running, was in awe of her courage to stand her ground. In that moment, his love for her solidified from a fragile hope into an unbreakable conviction. He had to protect her. He had to protect the world she was trying to build. "You won't have to face them alone," he said, the words feeling like a vow. She looked up at him, and her tired, fearful eyes filled with a profound gratitude and a deep, abiding affection. "I know," she whispered. As he walked her home that evening, under a sky streaked with the bruised purple and blood orange of a prairie sunset, Cole felt a fragile peace settle over him. He had found a reason to fight again. Not for money, not for survival, but for something good and pure. He believed that this time, he could be the man Clara saw. He could be the man who fixed things. He was wrong. He was a man who broke things, and the world was about to remind him, in the cruelest way imaginable, of that terrible, inescapable truth. The defiance of the schoolteacher became the talk of Dustwater. In the dim, smoky confines of the saloon and the dusty aisles of the general store, whispers of Clara Thorne's stand against Sterling and Thorne began to circulate. For the first time in a long time, a spark of resistance was kindled in the weary hearts of the townspeople. It was a small, fragile flame, but Mayor Alistair Sterling, a man who understood power, knew that even the smallest spark could grow into a wildfire if not immediately and ruthlessly extinguished. He could not afford a hero in his town, especially one as unimpeachable as the beloved schoolmarm. Sterling was a different kind of predator from the brutish thugs Cole had known in his past. He didn't rely on the speed of his drawl, but on the poison of his words. His arena was not the dusty street at high noon, but the shadowy back rooms where lies were forged and reputations were murdered. He knew that to attack Clara directly would make her a martyr. He had to turn the town against her, to isolate her, to make her own decency appear as a dangerous, fanatical flaw. He needed to frame the narrative, to twist her virtue into a crime. His campaign began subtly. He started spending his evenings in the saloon, not drinking heavily, but buying rounds for the ranchers and drifters, his voice a low, reasonable murmur amidst the boisterous noise. He spoke of progress, of the great future that awaited Dustwater, a future of prosperity that was being held back by certain elements who were resistant to change, who were stuck in the past. He never mentioned Clara by name, but everyone knew who he was talking about. "A town is like a wagon train," he'd say, swirling the amber whiskey in his glass. "We all have to pull in the same direction to get through the desert. If one person decides to put on the brakes because they're afraid of the road ahead, well, the whole train gets stuck in the sand." Jedediah Thorne, the land baron, employed a more direct, brutish approach. His deputies, a collection of hard-faced men with questionable pasts, began to lean on the local business owners. A delivery of goods to the general store would accidentally be delayed. A rancher who spoke favorably of Miss Thorne might find a section of his fence cut during the night, his cattle scattered to the winds. Fear was a more effective tool than persuasion, and Thorne wielded it like a cudgel. Cole saw the tide turning and felt a grim, familiar sense of foreboding. He tried to warn Clara, to make her understand the danger she was in. They were sitting on the small porch of her rented house one evening, watching the last of the light bleed from the sky. "These men, Clara," he said, his voice a low rumble, "they don't play by the rules, you know. They don't care about what's right. They only care about what's theirs. You've become a threat to them." "I know," she said, her hands clasped in her lap. She wasn't naive, but her courage was fortified by an unshakable belief in the fundamental goodness of people. But the people of this town know me. They know what I stand for. They won't listen to his lies. They're scared, Cole countered, his voice gentle but firm. And fear makes people believe in the lies that are easiest to swallow. It makes them turn on the very people who are trying to help them. He knew this from bitter experience. He had seen entire towns turn on one another under the pressure of a powerful, ruthless man. His warnings went unheeded. Clara, bolstered by the small, supportive gestures of a few brave townspeople, a woman leaving a freshly baked pie on her doorstep, a farmer quietly dropping off a bushel of apples, believed her stand was working. She couldn't see the whispers that were slithering through the town's fearful heart, the poison of Sterling's words taking root. The serpent needed a catalyst, a single event to crystallize the vague fears and resentments he had been cultivating into a concrete accusation. And he found it in the form of a drifter named Hank Miller, a distant, no-account cousin of the family from whom Cole had bought his farm. Miller was a drunk and a petty thief, and he had a grudge against the world, particularly against the man who now owned the land he felt should have been his. Sterling, with his keen eye for human weakness, saw Miller as the perfect pawn. He sat with the man, listened to his bitter complaints, and then, in a low, conspiratorial whisper, he planted a seed. He spoke of the injustice of it all, of how men like Miller were being pushed aside. He hinted that there were people in town, powerful people, like the schoolteacher, who were stirring up trouble, turning people against their neighbors, working with outsiders to take what wasn't theirs. He slipped a $20 gold piece into Miller's hand. "For your troubles," Sterling said. "A man ought to be able to count on his friends." 2 nights later, the catalyst occurred. A fire broke out at the town's small land registry office. It wasn't a large fire. It was discovered quickly and put out by a hastily formed bucket brigade. But the damage was done. The small, wooden building was gutted, and with it, the official records of land ownership and deeds for the entire county. Cole was in town at first light, having seen the glow in the sky from his farm. He found the town in an uproar. Sterling was standing on a crate in the middle of the street, his face a mask of solemn, righteous anger. This was no accident, he boomed, his voice carrying over the worried murmurs of the crowd. This was an act of sabotage, an attack on the very foundations of our community. There are those among us who wish to sow chaos, who would rather see this town burn than see it prosper. Cole watched from the edge of the crowd, a cold dread coiling in his stomach. He saw Hank Miller standing near the front, his face a mixture of fear and a strange, sullen pride. He saw Jedediah Thorne and his deputies moving through the crowd, their expressions grim and purposeful. This was it. The trap was being sprung. The next move came that afternoon. The town's sheriff, a weak-willed man named Peters who owed his job to Sterling, rode out to Cole's farm. He was accompanied by 2 of Thorne's deputies. Cole met them in the yard, his posture deceptively relaxed, his hands empty and in plain sight. "Cole," Sheriff Peters said, avoiding his gaze, "we need to ask you some questions about the fire last night." "I was here," Cole said, his voice flat. "Didn't know a thing about it till I saw the smoke." "Someone saw you," one of the deputies sneered, a beefy man with a cruel twist to his mouth. "Saw you talking with that troublemaking schoolmarm of yours just yesterday. Planning things, were you?" "I've got nothing more to say," Cole said, his eyes like chips of ice. "That's all right," the deputy said with a smug smile. "We're not here for you. Not yet, anyway." He unrolled a piece of paper. It was a warrant. "We're here for the woman, Clara Thorne. Under the authority of Mayor Sterling and the Dustwater Town Council, she's under arrest. Suspicion of arson and incitement to rebellion." The world tilted on its axis. Cole stared at the man, at the hateful, triumphant look in his eyes, and he felt a rage so pure and so absolute that it was a physical force, a white-hot wave that threatened to consume him. For a fleeting, terrible second, the ghost of Black Jack rose up, screaming for blood. His hand twitched, reaching for the phantom weight on his hip. He could kill these 3 men before they even cleared leather. He could take them all, right here, right now. But he crushed the impulse, burying it deep. To resort to violence now would be to prove them right. It would doom Clara completely. He had to play their game, to fight this with their rules, as twisted and corrupt as they were. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. She has nothing to do with this. Tell it to the judge, the deputy laughed. Let's go, boys. Let's go pick up our little fire starter. They mounted up and rode away, leaving Cole standing alone in the yard, the dust settling around him. He was a man caught in a nightmare. He had tried to build a life of peace, but the world of men and their lies had found him. And now, they were coming for the one thing in his life that was pure and good. They were coming for Clara. The serpent had whispered his lies, and the town had listened. And Cole knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the trap had not just been sprung for her. It had been sprung for him, too. They were trying to resurrect a ghost. The rest of Clara Thorne fell upon Dustwater like a shroud. The flame of resistance that had been so recently kindled was instantly extinguished, replaced by a cold, pervasive fear. If the town's most beloved and respected citizen could be dragged from her home and thrown in jail on the thinnest of pretexts, then no one was safe. Doors were bolted earlier. Neighbors who had once exchanged pleasantries now averted their eyes, afraid to be seen as sympathetic to the accused. The town held its breath, waiting to see what its new masters would do next. Cole rode into town and went straight to the small, clapboard building that served as the sheriff's office and jail. He found Sheriff Peters sitting behind his desk, staring into a half-empty bottle of whiskey. The man looked 10 years older than he had the day before. I want to see her, Peters, Cole said, his voice quiet but carrying the unyielding force of a tectonic plate. Peters didn't look up. Can't do that, Cole. Mayor's orders. No visitors. She's innocent, and you know it. The whole town knows it. What I know doesn't matter anymore, Peters mumbled, finally looking up. His eyes were bloodshot and filled with a mixture of fear and self-loathing. Sterling is the law now. He's convened a special tribunal. Says the regular circuit judge is 2 months away, and this is a matter of public security that requires immediate attention. A tribunal, Cole repeated, the word tasting like poison. What kind of tribunal? Sterling is the judge, Peters said, his voice barely a whisper. Jedediah Thorne and 2 of his ranchers are the jury. It's a hanging party, Cole, and they've already bought the rope. The sheer, naked corruption of it was breathtaking. It wasn't a trial. It was a piece of theater designed for one purpose, to deliver a verdict that had been decided upon long before the fire had ever been set. She needs a lawyer, Cole insisted, grabbing the edge of the desk. She has a right to a defense. And who's going to defend her? Peters asked with a bitter laugh. The only lawyer in this part of the country is a drunk in a town 100 miles away. Even if you could get him, Sterling wouldn't allow it. It's a closed hearing. For security reasons, he took a long swallow of whiskey. Go home, Cole. There's nothing you can do. There's nothing anyone can do. They have all the power. Power, Cole said, his voice a low growl, is a thing that can be taken away. He left the sheriff's office and stood in the dusty street, the afternoon sun beating down on him. He was a man in a cage. Every avenue, every rule of law and decency, had been cut off. He was a man who had renounced the gun, who had tried to live a life of peace, and now he was faced with a situation that peace could not solve. The ghost of Black Jack was stirring, whispering dark and simple solutions in his ear. But he couldn't listen. Not yet. For Clara's sake, he had to try one more time. He had to humble himself. He had to appeal to the devil himself. Alistair Sterling had set up his office in the town's small, defunct bank building, a symbolic choice that was not lost on anyone. Cole found him behind a large mahogany desk, reviewing a stack of papers. He looked up as Cole entered, his expression one of mild, feigned surprise. Mr. McCrae, he said, his voice smooth as old silk. To what do I owe the pleasure? Let her go, Sterling, Cole said, dispensing with any pretense. I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about, Sterling replied, leaning back in his chair, a small, smug smile playing on his lips. The law must take its course. No one is above the law. This isn't law. This is a lynching, Cole said, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. She's innocent. You framed her. Strong words, Mr. McCrae. Dangerous words. Sterling's eyes turned cold and hard. You seem to have a very personal interest in this matter. A man with no past, living on the edge of town, takes up with a woman who preaches rebellion to children. It's a suspicious combination, wouldn't you agree? He was being threatened. Sterling was connecting him to the crime, laying the groundwork to have him arrested next. The trap was closing. Cole swallowed his pride. He unclenched his fists. He did the hardest thing he had ever done in his life. He begged. "Please," he said, the word feeling like broken glass in his throat. "She is a good woman. She has done nothing wrong. Whatever you want, land, power, you can have it. The town won't resist you anymore. You've won. Just let her go. I will take her away from here. You will never see either of us again." He stood there, the quiet farmer, a man who had once faced down entire posses without blinking, now pleading for the life of the woman he loved. It was the ultimate act of self-abasement, final, desperate attempt to solve this the way the man named Cole would, with words and reason. Sterling listened, his head tilted, his expression unreadable. For a moment, a flicker of something. Was it pity? Was it consideration? Crossed his face. Then it was gone, replaced by the cold, reptilian certainty of a predator who has his prey cornered. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the dusty street. "It's a shame, you know," he said, his back to Cole. "She's a spirited woman. I admire that. But spirit, like a wild horse, must be broken for the good of the herd. The people need to see that there are consequences for defiance. They need to see that the old ways are dead, and that a new order has come to Dustwater. An execution, as tragic as it is, will be a powerful symbol of that new order. It will be the foundation stone of our future prosperity." He turned back to face Cole, and his eyes were devoid of any human warmth. "So, no, Mr. McCrae, I will not let her go. The tribunal will be held tomorrow at noon. The sentence will be carried out at sundown. The law is the law." Cole stared at him, and in that moment, he finally understood. He had been appealing to a man's conscience, his decency, his reason. But he was not talking to a man. He was talking to a monster, a creature who saw human lives as mere tools to be used and discarded in the pursuit of his ambition. He had tried. He had begged. He had reasoned. He had humbled himself. He had done everything the man named Cole could do. And he had failed. He turned and walked out of the office without another word. As he stepped out into the harsh sunlight, he knew that the man who had entered the bank, the quiet farmer who believed in second chances, was gone forever. He had been murdered in that room just as surely as Clara had been sentenced to death. He walked to the general store. He didn't buy flour or salt. He bought every box of .45 caliber cartridges they had. The storekeeper looked at him, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a dawning, terrible understanding. Cole's face was a blank, emotionless mask, but his eyes, his pale winter eyes, were no longer calm. A storm was gathering there, a storm of pure, cold, righteous fury. The law of the rope had been declared. But there was another law, an older law, that was about to be remembered in Dustwater. The law of the gun. The day of the execution dawned hot and breathless. The sky was a vast, empty bowl of pale, washed-out blue, and the sun was a merciless, white-hot eye that seemed to suck the very moisture from the air. The wind, for once, was still. The town of Dustwater was wrapped in a dead, oppressive silence, as if the world itself was holding its breath. In the center of the town square, a new and terrible structure had been erected. A crude gallows, built from fresh-cut pine, stood beside the town's oldest and largest oak tree. The raw, yellow wood seemed obscene against the dark, ancient bark of the tree. A single, thick rope, with a professionally tied hangman's noose at its end, dangled from the crossbeam, swaying almost imperceptibly in the heat shimmer. Cole stood at the back of the crowd that had been gathered to witness the event. He was a statue carved from granite. His face was devoid of all expression, a blank canvas upon which a terrible story was about to be painted. He was clean-shaven, and he wore a clean, dark shirt. He looked like a man attending a funeral. His own. He had spent the night in the darkness of his barn, not sleeping, but preparing. He had taken the guns out from the old wooden chest where they had been buried for 2 long years. The twin Colt peacemakers, with their smooth walnut grips and blued steel barrels. They were not the tools of a farmer. They were the instruments of a surgeon, a butcher, an artist of death. He had cleaned and oiled them with a slow, ritualistic precision, the familiar movements a dark sacrament. He had strapped on the worn leather gun belt, its weight settling on his hips with a sense of terrible, tragic homecoming. The ghost of Black Jack was no longer a whisper. He was flesh and blood once more, standing silent and watchful in the shell of the man named Cole. At noon, they brought her out. Clara was dressed in a simple, clean dress. Her hands were tied behind her back. She was pale, but she walked with her head held high, her steps firm. Her courage, even in the face of this final, terrible injustice, was a thing of awesome, heartbreaking beauty. She did not look at the gallows. She did not look at the hostile, fearful faces in the crowd. Her eyes scanned the town square until they found him. Their gazes locked across the silent, dusty space. In her eyes, he saw not fear, not accusation, not even sadness. He saw love, a pure, unconditional love that accepted him, all of him, even the darkness he had tried so hard to hide from her. She gave him a small, sad smile, a final, silent message of forgiveness and farewell. And in that moment, the last vestiges of the man named Cole shattered, turning to dust and blowing away on a wind that had not yet begun to blow. Mayor Sterling stood on the platform, Bible in his hand, his face a mask of solemn piety. He read the charges and the verdict of his sham tribunal in a clear, resonant voice, his words a grotesque parody of justice. Jedediah Thorne and his deputies stood near the steps of the gallows, their hands on their pistols, their faces grim and self-important. When Sterling was finished, a black hood was placed over Clara's head. The noose was fitted around her neck. She did not flinch. Cole stood and watched. He did nothing. He said nothing. The crowd murmured, their fear and shame a palpable thing. They knew they were watching the murder of an innocent woman, and they knew their own silence made them complicit. But they did nothing. The hangman, a burly, anonymous figure brought in from out of town, checked the rope and looked to Sterling. The mayor gave a crisp, clean nod. The trapdoor sprang open with a loud, ugly crack that echoed across the silent square. Clara fell. The rope snapped taut. And in the bright and forgiving glare of the midday sun, a good and decent woman, whose only crime was a belief in justice and a love for a broken man, was strangled from the world. Cole did not look away. He watched until the last, terrible twitching had ceased. He burned the image into his memory, the slight figure twisting at the end of the rope, the sun in her hair, the obscene stillness that followed. He felt something inside him die. The part of him that had dared to hope, to believe in redemption, to love it all went cold and dark. And in that cold, dark void, something else awoke. Something ancient and terrible. A promise of a reckoning. The crowd began to disperse, silent and ashamed, eager to retreat back into their homes, to pretend they had not seen what they had just seen. Sterling and Thorne stood on the platform for a moment, the proud architects of their new order. No one paid any attention to the quiet man at the back of the crowd as he turned and walked away. No one saw the look in his eyes. The pale blue was gone. They were flat, gray, and empty, like the eyes of a dead shark. The ghost of Black Jack was gone too. Ghosts feel remorse. Ghosts feel sorrow. The thing that walked in Cole McRae's body now felt nothing at all. It was a machine built for one purpose: vengeance. That night, a hot, dry wind began to blow, the kind the old-timers called a devil wind. It rattled windows and howled down chimneys, carrying the scent of dust and something else. The scent of fire. Just after midnight, the stables at Jedediah Thorne's end of town burst into flames, the fire spreading with a natural speed. While the town was distracted by the blaze, Cole McRae, the quiet farmer, disappeared from his homestead. He took nothing with him but his guns, his horse, and a promise he had made to the memory of a dead woman. The sun would rise again on Dustwater. But for the men who had killed Clara Thorne, the sun had already set for the last time. The morning after the hanging, Dustwater woke to a sky choked with smoke and a town gripped by a new and unfamiliar fear. The smoldering, blackened ruins of Jedediah Thorne's stables were a testament to the chaos of the previous night. But it was the discovery on the gate of the town square that truly signaled the beginning of the nightmare. One of Thorne's deputies, a swaggering brute named Dawson who had been particularly cruel in his taunts to Clara as they led her to the gallows, was found hanging upside down, his arms swinging free. His throat had been cut from ear to ear with a single, brutally efficient slash, the work of a man who knew his anatomy. His eyes were wide with a terror that death had not erased. And stuffed into his mouth, held tight between his teeth, was a single, silver dollar. Panic, cold and sharp, began to snake through the streets. This was not a random act of violence. It was a message. A declaration of war. Sheriff Peters, looking pale and shaken, cut the body down, his hands trembling so badly he could barely handle the knife. He recognized the gruesome signature. It was a marker used by bounty hunters and outlaws in the old days, a sign of a debt paid. But no one could fathom who in this beaten-down town had the skill or the audacity to do such a thing. Cole McRae, the quiet farmer, was gone. When a posse rode out to his homestead to ask him some questions, they found the cabin empty. The door was unlocked. A half-eaten meal sat on the table. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air. Alistair Sterling and Jedediah Thorne met in the mayor's office, the mood no longer one of triumphant conspiracy, but of grim, paranoid concern. "It's him," Thorne growled, pacing the room like a caged bear. "The farmer. McRae. He did this. I knew he was trouble." "Don't be a fool, Jedediah," Sterling retorted, though his voice lacked its usual confident edge. "McRae is a dirt-scrabbling homesteader. He doesn't have the stomach for this kind of work. This is something else. A professional. One of the schoolmarm's relatives, perhaps, seeking revenge." "I don't care who it is," Thorne snarled. "I want him found. I want every man I have scouring these hills. I want his head on a platter." But the hunter they sought was not in the hills. He was a ghost, and he had already melted back into the shadows of the town itself. The man who had been Cole McRae was dead, and Black Jack had no need for the sanctuary of a farm. The town was his hunting ground now. He moved through the back alleys and shadowed livery stables, a phantom of vengeance sustained by a cold, burning hatred. He knew the routines of Thorne's men, their weaknesses, the saloons they frequented, the women they visited. He had spent 2 years in quiet observation, and now he was putting that knowledge to use. The second night, the devil wind returned, howling through the streets like a banshee. The remaining deputies, spooked by Dawson's death, moved in pairs, their hands never far from their guns. They saw threats in every shadow, enemies in the face of every townsperson. 2 of them, a rat-faced man named Calloway and a hulking giant named Blevins, were tasked with guarding Thorne's main ranch house. They sat on the porch, a bottle of whiskey passing between them, their nerves frayed. "This ain't right," Calloway said, his voice a nervous whisper. "To hang a woman it ain't right. It brings a bad omen on a place." "Shut your damn mouth," Blevins grumbled, though he kept glancing into the oppressive darkness beyond the porch light. "She got what she deserved. And so will this bastard who killed Dawson." From the darkness of the barn, 100 yards away, Black Jack watched them through the sights of a stolen Creedmoor rifle. He was a creature of absolute patience. He waited as the whiskey bottle emptied, as their vigilance dulled, as their conversation faded into a comfortable, drunken silence. He didn't fire the rifle. A gunshot would raise the alarm. Instead, he set the rifle aside and picked up a bow he had fashioned that afternoon from a supple length of Osage orange wood. The arrows were tipped not with stone, but with sharpened steel files, honed to a razor's edge. The first arrow flew from the darkness with a soundless hiss. It took Blevins in the throat, severing his jugular. The big man made a choked, gurgling sound, his eyes wide with shocked disbelief as he clawed at the shaft protruding from his neck. He slid from his chair and collapsed to the porch, his lifeblood pumping out into the dust. Calloway, drunk and confused, stared at his partner, unable to process what had just happened. "Blevins, what in the hell?" Before he could finish the sentence, Black Jack was moving. He sprinted from the barn, a dark, fleeting shape covering the open ground with the speed of a panther. He was on the porch before Calloway could even think to draw his weapon. The rat-faced man looked up and saw a face from a nightmare. The eyes were flat and dead, the mouth a grim, merciless line. Calloway opened his mouth to scream, but the sound was cut off as Black Jack's hand, hard as iron, clamped over his face. With his other hand, he drove a long, thin skinning knife deep into Calloway's belly, once, twice, 3 times. He let the body fall and stood for a moment, breathing heavily, the coppery scent of blood filling his nostrils. The cold, familiar work was done. He dragged Calloway's body to the barn and strung it up by the heels from a rafter. Then he went back to the porch, retrieved Blevins' corpse, and laid it out neatly on the front steps of the ranch house. He placed another silver dollar on the dead man's unseeing eyes. 2 more of Thorne's men were dead. The message was escalating. The next morning, the discovery of the two new bodies sent a fresh wave of terror through the community. This was no ordinary killer. This was a ghost, an artist of death who could strike anywhere, at any time, with brutal, terrifying precision. The name Black Jack began to be whispered again, an old legend resurrected from the grave. The few old-timers who remembered the stories looked at each other with a dawning, horrified understanding. Thorne's remaining men began to desert him. They were hired thugs, not soldiers. They had signed on for bullying and intimidation, not to be hunted by a phantom who killed in the dark. They began to slip away, one by one, riding out of Dustwater with their meager pay, preferring the uncertainty of the trail to the certainty of a violent death. Sterling and Thorne found themselves increasingly isolated, their power base crumbling with each new body that was discovered. The fear they had so expertly wielded against the town was now being turned back on them, magnified 100-fold. They had executed a schoolteacher to create an example, to forge a new order. Instead, they had unleashed a demon, and his methods were far more effective than theirs. The foundation stone of their new prosperity had become a tombstone, and Black Jack was just beginning to chisel the names. The fear in Dustwater curdled into something thicker and more poisonous, a suffocating paranoia. The town was a powder keg, and Black Jack was the slow-burning fuse. Jedediah Thorne's empire, built on intimidation and brute force, was hemorrhaging then. Of the dozen deputies he had employed, only a handful of the most loyal or most foolish remained. They no longer swaggered through the streets, they scurried, their eyes wide and constantly scanning the rooftops and alleyways. The hunter had become the hunted, and the prey was beginning to turn on itself. Alistair Sterling, a man who prided himself on his intellect and control, felt that control slipping through his fingers like fine sand. He tried to project an aura of calm authority, but the townspeople saw the truth in the dark circles under his eyes and the slight, constant tremor in his hands. He and Thorne were now virtual prisoners in Thorne's large, two-story ranch house, which they had fortified like a besieged fort. Black Jack did not strike again for 3 nights. The silence was, in its own way, more terrifying than the killings. The remaining deputies grew jumpy, their nerves stretched to the breaking point. They started seeing ghosts in every shadow, hearing assassins in every gust of wind. An argument over a card game in the saloon escalated into a drunken gunfight between 2 of Thorne's own men, leaving one dead and the other fleeing into the night. Black Jack hadn't needed to lift a finger. Thorne's organization was beginning to cannibalize itself. It was during this lull that Sterling's mind, sharp and analytical, began to work. He finally accepted the unbelievable truth. The quiet farmer, Cole McRae, was Black Jack. It was the only explanation that fit the impossible facts. And if that was true, then he was not dealing with a simple vengeful homesteader. He was dealing with a legend, a master strategist of violence. He realized that Black Jack was not just killing his men, he was dismantling his entire operation, piece by piece, psychologically as well as physically. The next target on Black Jack's list was not a man, but the source of Thorne's power, his water. Thorne owned the rights to the only reliable river in the region, and he used it to control the smaller ranchers, charging them exorbitant fees to water their cattle. On the 4th night, under the cover of a moonless sky, Black Jack rode out to the main dam that Thorne had built to control the river's flow. It was a massive earthen and timber structure, guarded by 2 of Thorne's last remaining loyalists. Black Jack did not engage the guards directly. He had spent a day gathering what he needed from an abandoned mining camp deep in the hills, several crates of old and stable dynamite. Using the skills from a long-forgotten chapter of his life when he had worked as a miner, he spent hours carefully placing the charges at the dam's weakest points, deep below the waterline. He worked with the patient, meticulous focus of a watchmaker, the only sound the gentle lapping of the water and the whisper of the wind. Just before dawn, as the guards were drowsy and inattentive, he lit the long, slow-burning fuses and melted back into the darkness. The explosion was a deep, guttural roar that rolled across the plains, waking the entire town of Dustwater. It was followed by the sound of 1,000,000 gallons of water, released from its bondage, thundering down the dry riverbed. The dam, the symbol and instrument of Thorne's control, had been breached. The river was free. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic for Thorne. His own prize cattle, gathered in the fields downstream, were scattered and drowned by the flash flood. The smaller ranchers, their own lands now irrigated by the free-flowing water, saw the act not as terrorism, but as liberation. Their allegiance, which had been held by fear, now shifted. The ghost who haunted Dustwater was not just an executioner, he was a savior. The destruction of the dam was a crippling blow, but Black Jack's ledger was not yet balanced. The next name on his list was Hank Miller, the drunken drifter who had set the fire and provided the false testimony that had condemned Clara. Miller had been hiding in the saloon, drinking himself into a state of terrified oblivion on the money Sterling had paid him. That night, Black Jack came for him. He didn't sneak in. He walked through the batwing doors, a tall, dark silhouette against the night. The saloon, which had been noisy, fell into a dead, absolute silence. Every eye was on him. He was no longer the quiet farmer. He was Black Jack in the flesh. The twin Colts rested on his hips, their grips worn smooth by a killer's hand. His face was a chiseled mask of cold fury, and his winter skies scanned the room, instantly finding his target. Miller, who was cowering at a back table, let out a pathetic whimper and tried to scramble away. Black Jack did not draw. He simply walked toward him, his boot heels echoing on the wooden floor like the steady ticking of a clock counting down a man's last seconds. The other patrons, a mix of ranchers and drifters, shrank back, clearing a path. No one was foolish enough to interfere. "You lied," Black Jack said, his voice a low, chilling whisper that was more terrifying than a shout. "You took their money and you lied. And a woman died because of it." "He made me do it," Miller shrieked, pointing a trembling finger toward the mayor's office. "It was Sterling. He paid me." "I know," Black Jack said. "His turn is coming. But first, you pay for the part you played." He grabbed Miller by the front of his filthy shirt and dragged him from the saloon, out into the dusty street. He hauled him to the town square, to the terrible oak tree where Clara had died. He threw a rope over the same thick branch, fashioning a crude noose. Miller sobbed and pleaded, his legs kicking, but it was like arguing with a glacier. "Please, McCrae. I got a family. Have mercy." Black Jack paused, looking at the sniveling, wretched man. "She asked for mercy too," he said, his voice as cold and empty as the grave. "And they gave her a rope. The least I can do is give you the same." He kicked the crate out from under Miller's feet. He didn't wait to watch. He turned and walked away, leaving the body to swing in the wind, a gruesome warning to all who had played a part, no matter how small, in Clara's death. The ghost's ledger was methodical. Every debt would be collected, every sin accounted for, and the biggest names were yet to be crossed off. The hanging of Hank Miller was the final straw. The carefully constructed edifice of fear that Sterling and Thorne had built was not just cracked, it was shattered. The people of Dustwater, who had been cowed into silent complicity, now saw a force more terrifying and, in a strange, brutal way, more just than the corrupt authority of the mayor. They saw a ghost who was not just killing, but cleansing. Sterling and Thorne knew their time was running out. They were isolated in Thorne's ranch house, now more of a prison than a fortress. Thorne, a man of action, was slowly being driven mad by the waiting. He paced the rooms like a caged animal, drinking heavily, his temper growing more volatile with each passing hour. "We have to get out of here," he roared at Sterling, slamming a bottle down on a table. "We take what we can and ride for Mexico. To hell with this town. To hell with him." Sterling, ever the strategist, knew that was a death sentence. And be hunted across 1,000 miles of desert? Don't be an idiot. Black Jack is not a man you can outrun. Our only chance is to make a stand here, to force him to come to us, on our ground. Their ground was down to 3 men: Thorne, Sterling, and Thorne's last remaining deputy, a loyal but slow-witted gunman named Marcus. It was a pathetic army to stand against a legend. Black Jack knew they were waiting for him. He could have starved them out, picked them off one by one over a matter of weeks. But the cold fire that drove him demanded a final, definitive confrontation. This was not just about killing them. It was about destroying the world they had built, the symbols of their corrupt power. He would not hunt them like rats in a hole. He would grant them the final battle they so desperately wanted, but it would be on his terms. The final sunset was a spectacle of impossible, bloody beauty. The sky was streaked with crimson and gold, as if the heavens themselves were bleeding. As the last light faded and the first stars began to prick the deep velvet of the night sky, Black Jack began his assault. He didn't ride up to the front door. He approached from the back, from the direction of the smoldering ruins of the stables. He was carrying a heavy burlap sack. Inside were a dozen mason jars filled with coal oil and fitted with cloth wicks. He moved with a ghostly silence, placing the jars at the base of the wooden ranch house, beneath windows and against the dry, sun-baked porch railings. When he was done, he retreated to the cover of a nearby outcrop of rock, took out a match, and lit a flaming arrow. He drew his bow and sent the fiery messenger coursing through the night. It struck the porch railing, and the nearest jar erupted in a whoosh of flame. He fired another, and then another. Within a minute, the entire back of the ranch house was engulfed in a wall of fire. Inside, the three men were thrown into a state of panicked chaos. The fire spread with terrifying speed, smoke billowing through the hallways. "It's him. He's burning us out," Thorne screamed, his face a mask of enraged disbelief. "The front. We have to get out the front door," Sterling yelled, his voice tight with panic. They stumbled through the smoke-filled house, their lungs burning, their eyes streaming. They burst out onto the front porch, silhouetted against the raging inferno behind them, and found themselves in a perfectly illuminated kill zone. Black Jack was waiting for them, standing in the middle of the yard, 100 feet away. He was not in cover. He stood in the open, the light from the burning house flickering across his stony face. He held a Colt in each hand. This was not an assassination. This was a duel. A final, formal reckoning. Marcus, the deputy, reacted on pure instinct, drawing his pistol and firing wildly. His shots went wide. Black Jack's right-hand Colt barked once, a single, clean shot. Marcus spun around and fell, a bullet hole perfectly placed in the center of his chest. Jedediah Thorne, bellowing with a cornered animal's rage, drew his own weapon. He was a big man, and a powerful one, but his rage made him clumsy. He fired one shot, then another. Black Jack stood his ground, and moving. He fired twice, the two shots so close together they sounded like one. One bullet took Thorne in the knee, shattering the bone and sending him crashing to the porch floor. The second struck him in the gut. Thorne lay on the porch, wounded and dying, a look of shocked agony on his face. Now only Sterling was left. The politician, the man of words and schemes, stood frozen, his face pale and slick with sweat in the firelight. He held a small, fancy pistol in his hand, but he made no move to raise it. He was looking at the face of pure, implacable vengeance, and he knew his life was over. Black Jack walked forward slowly, his boots crunching on the dry grass, the twin Colts held steady at his sides. He stopped at the foot of the porch, looking down at the dying Thorne and up at the terrified Sterling. "You took everything from me," he said, and his voice was the sound of a tombstone being scraped across granite. "It was just business," Sterling stammered, his mind still trying to negotiate, to reason with the hurricane. "Politics power." Black Jack raised his left-hand Colt and fired. The bullet struck Sterling in the shoulder, spinning him around. He raised the right-hand Colt and fired again. The second bullet hit Sterling's other shoulder. The mayor collapsed to his knees, his pistol clattering from his nerveless fingers. He was disarmed, broken, helpless. Black Jack stepped up onto the porch. He walked over to the whimpering, bleeding form of Jedediah Thorne. He looked down at the man who had stood by and watched Clara die. He raised his pistol, aimed it carefully at Thorne's head, and fired. Then he turned and walked to where Sterling was kneeling, sobbing. He holstered his pistols. The killing was done. Now, the final judgment. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single, thick rope. It was the hangman's noose from the gallows in the town square. He had cut it down that afternoon. "The law is the law," Black Jack whispered, his voice cold as the grave. He looped the rope around the neck of the man who had so righteously spoken those words. He dragged the mayor, kicking and screaming, from the porch of his burning monument to greed, toward the lone, skeletal shape of a windmill that stood in the yard. The last sunset for Dustwater was complete, and the dawn would rise on a town cleansed by fire and blood. Dawn broke, gray and sorrowful, over the wounded landscape. A pall of greasy smoke hung in the air, a funeral shroud over the valley. The Thorne Ranch house was a blackened, skeletal ruin, its chimneys standing like lonely tombstones against the pale sky. The windmill turned with a slow, agonizing groan in the morning breeze, and from its highest point, the body of Alistair Sterling swayed gently, a gruesome pendulum marking the end of a corrupt and bloody era. The people of Dustwater emerged from their homes, drawn by a mixture of morbid curiosity and a dawning, fearful hope. They gathered in silent, scattered groups, staring at the carnage. They saw the bodies of Marcus and Jedediah Thorne on the charred porch, and they saw the fate of the man who had styled himself their mayor. And they understood. The reckoning was complete. The ghost who had haunted their town had finished his work. Sheriff Peters was the one to cut Sterling's body down. He did it with a grim, weary resolve, the self-loathing in his eyes having been replaced by a kind of hollowed-out acceptance. He had been a coward, a pawn in a wicked game, but he was still the closest thing to the law the town had left. As he laid the body on the ground, he found a silver dollar tucked neatly into Sterling's vest pocket. A final, chilling signature. There was no sign of Cole McCrae. He had vanished as completely and as silently as he had reappeared. His work was done, and the man or the specter had melted back into the landscape that had birthed him. A strange and profound quiet settled over Dustwater in the days that followed. It was not the silence of fear that had preceded the reckoning, but the quiet of a town in shock, a town taking its first, tentative breaths after a long and terrible fever. The power vacuum left by Sterling and Thorne was absolute. There was no one to give orders, no one to collect taxes, no one to intimidate and bully. The people were, for the first time in a long time, left to themselves. They began to clean up. A group of ranchers, now free of Thorne's control over the water, worked together to clear the debris from the flash flood. The general store owner, who had been forced to extend credit to Thorne's men, declared a jubilee, forgiving the small debts of his struggling neighbors. A quiet and stated sense of community, long suppressed under the heel of tyranny, began to re-emerge. They buried their dead in the small, windswept cemetery on the hill. There was a plot for Clara Thorne, and the women of the town covered it with what few wild flowers they could find. A short distance away, a series of unmarked graves were dug for Sterling, Thorne, and their men. There were no prayers said for them. Their only eulogy was the scorched earth of the ranch and the collective, and spoken relief of the town they had tried to strangle. The story of what had happened became an instant and powerful legend. It was told in hushed tones in the saloon, around dinner tables, and by parents to their children as a cautionary tale. They spoke of the quiet farmer, the good man who had been pushed too far, and they spoke of the ghost who had answered, the terrible, righteous avenger known as Black Jack. He became a part of the town's folklore, a local deity of vengeance. They said he had not been a man at all, but the spirit of the land itself, risen up to cleanse the corruption that had poisoned it. Cole, of course, was just a man, a broken man. He rode north, into the high, lonely country of the territories, with no destination in mind. He was a ghost once more, but of a different kind. He was not hiding from his past anymore, he was chained to it. The cold, killing rage that had sustained him through his bloody work in Dustwater had receded, leaving behind a void of grief and emptiness so profound it was a physical ache. He rode through nameless, one-street towns and vast, empty plains, seeing none of it. His world was the interior landscape of his own soul, a desolate place haunted by the memory of Clara's smile and the feel of a pistol butt in his hand. The man named Cole and the ghost of Black Jack were now one and the same, locked in a terrible, eternal embrace. He had sought redemption and found only damnation. He had tried to build a life, and had become a master of death. He did not seek work. He did not seek companionship. He ate when he was hungry, slept when he was exhausted, and rode when he could no longer bear the stillness. He was waiting. For what? He did not know. A bullet, a snakebite, a blizzard. He was waiting for an end to the story, a final, quiet peace that he knew he had not earned and did not deserve. The love he had found with Clara had been his one chance at heaven, and in avenging her, he had consigned himself to a living hell. Years passed. The West was changing, the wild and tamed frontier being slowly but surely tamed by the relentless march of telegraph wires, railroads, and the rule of law. The era of the gunslinger was dying, fading into myth and dime novel fantasy. And with it, the name of Black Jack began to fade from all but the most persistent of memories. Dustwater, against all odds, had survived. More than survived, it had healed. The free-flowing river had brought a quiet prosperity to the small ranchers. New families, attracted by the promise of land and a community that looked after its own, had settled in the valley. The schoolhouse, Clara's schoolhouse, was expanded. A new, young teacher arrived, a woman full of the same hope and determination, and when she was told the story of her predecessor, she hung a small, simple portrait of Clara Thorne on the wall. A quiet tribute to the town's martyred saint. The story of Black Jack's reckoning was now a legend told to wide-eyed children, a local ghost story to be whispered around a campfire. It had lost its sharp edges of blood and terror and had been polished by time into a myth of justice, a warning to any who would seek to impose their will on the free people of the valley. The burned-out ruins of the Thorne Ranch were left as they were, a stark, silent monument to the events of that terrible week. And what of Cole McRae? The man himself was gone, but the whispers remained. Like a ghost on the wind, his name would surface from time to time in the far-flung corners of the territory. A bartender in a mining town in the Colorado mountains would tell a story of a silent, pale-eyed stranger who had faced down 3 rowdy prospectors without ever drawing his gun. His stillness and the weight of his gaze enough to send them scurrying into the night. A sheriff in a booming cattle town in Wyoming would recall a drifter who had passed through, a man with old scars and the saddest eyes he'd ever seen. The drifter had helped track a lost child, showing a skill in the wilderness that was uncanny, and then had disappeared before anyone could properly thank him, accepting no payment. A doctor in a small Nebraska town would remember treating a man for a gunshot wound, a man who gave no name and spoke only a handful of words. The wound was from a fight the doctor later learned had been in defense of a homesteader's family being run off their land by railroad thugs. The stranger had settled the dispute with a terrifying, brutal efficiency, and then had ridden on before the sun was up. These were all just stories, fragments of a life lived in the shadows. No one ever knew the name of the quiet stranger, but the descriptions were always the same: tall, lean, with eyes the color of a winter sky, and a sadness so profound it seemed to be the man's only true possession. He was a ghost, a wandering ronin of the plains, forever seeking a penance that could never be found. He used his deadly skills not for profit or fame, but to protect the weak, the innocent, the kinds of people that Clara had cherished. Each small act of justice was a prayer, a desperate offering to the memory of the woman he had failed to protect. He was not seeking redemption. He knew that was impossible. The blood on his hands could never be washed away. He was simply serving his sentence, a life of lonely, violent atonement. The ghost of Black Jack, the killer, had been resurrected to save the town. Now, the man named Cole was forced to live with that ghost, to use its terrible skills to honor the memory of the love that had been his salvation and his doom. He was a myth in his own lifetime, a man who had become a story, forever riding toward a horizon that promised no peace. A solitary figure defined by the two things he had lost, a woman's love and his own soul. The final story, the one that is most often told, takes place a decade after the cleansing of Dustwater. It comes from a small, forgotten settlement on the Mexican border, a place of adobe huts and desperate men, where the law was a distant rumor and life was cheap. An old priest, who had spent his life ministering to the lost souls of this harsh land, told of a stranger who rode into town one day. The stranger was old now, his hair gray, his face a leathery mask of sun and sorrow. But his eyes, the priest said, were the same pale, winter sky blue, and they held the weight of 100 lifetimes of grief. The stranger didn't come for whiskey or women. He came to the small, crumbling mission. He sat in the back pew for a long time, not praying, but just sitting in the cool silence. He then approached the priest and made a confession. He did not ask for absolution, the priest recalled. He only seemed to need to tell the story, to give voice to the ghosts that haunted him, to speak her name one last time to a man of God. He spoke of a woman named Clara, of a quiet farm, of a life he had almost dared to believe he could have. And he spoke of the fire and blood and vengeance that had followed, his voice a low, emotionless monotone, as if he were recounting a story that had happened to someone else. When he was done, he placed a small, worn leather pouch on the altar. For the children, he said, for a school. Inside, the priest would later find a small fortune in old gold coins, the last remnants of a bloody and violent past, now offered up in a final, desperate act of penance. The stranger then turned and walked out of the church, into the fiery glare of the setting sun. What happened next is the stuff of legend. Some say he simply mounted his horse and rode south into the vast, empty expanse of the Mexican desert to finally be consumed by the silence and the sun. But the story the old-timers prefer, the one they tell around the flickering embers of a campfire, is different. They say that as the stranger mounted up, a band of bandidos, who had been terrorizing the region for months, rode into the village, their guns blazing. They were led by a famously cruel man named El Martillo Hammer. The stranger, the old gray-haired man, did not ride away. He did not seek cover. He simply sat his horse in the middle of the dusty street and waited. El Martillo and his men, seeing this lone, old man as an easy piece of sport, charged toward him. And then, the legend says, for one last, glorious, terrible time, Black Jack returned. They said the old man's hands were a blur, a movement of impossible, arthritic grace. The twin colts, which no one had even seen, were suddenly in his hands, bucking and roaring. The sound of the gunshots, they say, was not a series of individual reports, but a continuous, rolling thunder that echoed through the small village. When the smoke cleared, El Martillo and his 5 men lay dead or dying in the dust. The old stranger was still sitting on his horse, but he was slumped in the saddle, his body riddled with bullets. The priest ran to his side. The man looked at him, and for the first time, the priest saw the ghost of a smile touch the old man's lips. The terrible, haunted sadness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a profound and final peace. "Clara," he whispered, his last breath a sigh on the desert wind. They buried him in an unmarked grave behind the old mission, a quiet man who had died defending a town that was not his own. No one knew his real name. But as the priest said the final prayers, he looked up at the setting sun, brilliant, bloody spectacle on the horizon, and he knew he had just borne witness to the end of a legend. Out on the plains, in the high, lonely country, the wind still whispers through the tall grass. And if you listen closely, they say, you can still hear the story of a man who loved a woman, who lost his soul, and who spent a lifetime trying to buy it back, one bullet, one good deed, one act of violent penance at a time, until his final, bloody sunset.